One of the biggest things that the kawaii fashion is associated with is sexualization, and that just makes me so mad because I know the history, and so now I'm going to tell you, so you can also be mad about it, alright? So the backdrop of kawaii has to do with the student uprisings in Japan of the 1960s and 1970. Singular. And another reason that I found this interesting was because it has a scary amount of parallels to the modern day United States of America. With a high increase in university rates, but not enough jobs to keep up, they were having either unemployment or people going into positions that they were overqualified for. Something that we see in the modern day USA with millennials. But we'll get to that later. Now, in general, sexualization of anything or any broad fashion or movement that isn't wholly about that is wrong. That's okay, easy, we're all good. However, it makes me especially mad because kawaii initially was started to pointedly not be sexual and be a counterculture movement that wasn't like that, very pointedly so, and then now it's been turned around and turned into that. And that's disgusting. Now, the backdrop to how kawaii was started is extremely important, but also a little bit long, but also so interesting. So, it all starts with the student uprisings in Japan of the 1960s and 1970. So similarly to how in the 70s America was going through the hippie movement with the anti-Vietnam protests, Japan also saw a very similar thing. In the 1960s, Japan saw huge urbanization. Something that in the US took a century happened in Japan in only 25 years. So there is a very clear culture shock for those involved. While originally they were in farming communities and had very close-knit connections with their communities, suddenly they were in large cities and did not have this kind of connection at all. They were now in this new place with no feelings of belonging or anything at all. Now, as a part of Japan's urbanization, they also started a new education system. Way more people were partaking in the education system, as before in rural communities people were largely uneducated or minimally educated. Now they were getting formal education in public schools that were meant to emulate the US system of public education. This started what was referred to as Juken Senso, or the entrance exam wars. It started fairly young as in some cases elementary school, but more largely, especially at the time, in middle school, there was this intense focus on getting good placements in entrance exams for high schools. This meant that even as young as kids in middle school, they were spending every moment of every day studying and revising for these exams. Some kids would say that the only thing that they talked to their friends about was exams and studying, which certainly isn't a great thing or mentality. This would then continue as they entered high school. These high schools that they spent their whole middle school lives doing exams to get into, they spent the entirety of their high school lives doing entrance exams to get into university. A mix of because of how hard they worked to get into these universities, as well as an expectation that the universities would be how they were for the generation before them, that is, very close-knit connections with teachers, small class sizes, and just a very intimate setting. However, when they got there, because of the high amount of students there were, this was something they had not seen before. Again, because of the urbanization, there was just this huge influx of people that they weren't prepared for. Universities went from these close-knit settings to being lecture halls with microphones, and you didn't have any kind of close connection with your university professors. They were already getting disgruntled because of this. And then when they graduated university, they were expecting to get very elite, high-paying jobs as they had this university education. But because of the inflation caused by, again, how many students were in university, there weren't enough jobs to keep up with this. Unemployment for those with a university education went from 3% to 19%. Which I want you all to note that this is also something that we're seeing in the modern day United States of America. There is a huge increase in the amount of people going to university, as that is the only way you can get a decent paying job. However, there aren't enough jobs to then meet this demand, and so a lot of university grads are left without a job, or they're having to get jobs that they are overqualified for. You also see that a lot of millennials and Gen Z are getting very frustrated with the system and starting to protest and call for change. But I'm just gonna leave that there. To get back to the Japanese student uprisings, these people were here in new spaces with none of the community that they used to have, having identity crises, and also unable to get the jobs that they had been promised and had fought so hard for. This created the perfect environment for them to start protesting and call for the dismantling of the system. And so that's what they did. Despite happening at the same time, the Japanese student uprisings were very, very different from those happening in the West. Now, some of them were similar. There was a call for the end of the Vietnam War, even despite, or pointedly despite, the fact that Japan was economically greatly helped by the Vietnam War. However, they had this kind of like moral sense that they had to stick to morals no matter if they benefited from something like this or not. And so they still were against the Vietnam War. They also were against capitalism, much like the hippies were. They thought that capitalism and Marxism was part of the reason for all of the problems that they were saying. And they also kind of held the idea that with the dismantling of capitalism and a new system, that many of the other problems that they were facing could then be fixed by this. But by far the biggest thing that they were protesting against, and was very different from the West, was they were protesting the academic industrial complex. The academic industrial complex is what had initially started the Jukensenso, the academic entrance exam wars. And so they were very much so against it. It caused them all of this stress and all of these problems, and then they followed everything that they were told and they still didn't get jobs. So they were like, something's up with this system. Let's dismantle it. You know, I think they were more educated than me, and they probably could have said that properly in Japanese. They also felt that this new industrialization of academics is also why they had such a different experience from the generations before them. If it was less industrialized, then they could have had those smaller class sizes and more intimate things that they wanted that the previous generation had. This focus also changed the way that they protested. They would barricade within those universities and do things very centered around universities. In 1966 and 1967, they made some very specific demands, things like lower tuition and just stuff around those lines. However, once those demands were met, they had very vague ideas, and it was more so of a conceptual idea that they were protesting, rather than specific things that they wanted. And this would wind up being part of their downfall. They didn't have a singular thing to unify with, so they wound up just kind of fizzling out. Another part of the downfall was the fact that it was only focused on academics. When you focus on something like capitalism or wealth inequality, that's something that not only students could get behind, but also that workers and unions could get behind and help rally with. Because the focus was only on academics and only supported by students, the general public didn't really get behind the movement, which really hurt them. They also couldn't really expand the movement as there were only so many students. But let's get more into the counterculture movements that were a part of the Japanese student uprisings. Now, there's this idea that everyone was living in the same... So there was this idea that everyone was living in the same 1968, because to a degree that was more so true than it had ever been before. They were getting an amount of coverage from what was happening in other parts of the world, but it wasn't very accurate coverage. So the things that would come over from the West, the United States, England, about those protests and counterculture movements was very poorly translated and it was very delayed, and so the cultures were very, very different. They also enjoyed very different things. So despite this notion, the Japanese countercultures were radically different from the American ones. While the US was having rock be a center of their protests, the Japanese hated rock. They felt that it was too commercialized and went into capitalism in that very thing that they were trying to fight against. Instead, the Japanese much preferred folk music and ballads for their protesting. which is kind of funny to me, but I guess that's my westernized experience. It was much more accessible to them as the music was cheaper and they had more access to those resources as it was already a popular music, and they also just kind of vibed with it better, I guess. Similarly, even things like hairstyle vastly differed. So in the US, long hair was a symbol of that movement, while in Japan, short hair stayed until about 1970, but even so wasn't nearly as broad of a thing and was oftentimes seen as kind of a bad, don't do that, my dude. Something else that was very unique to Japan and the baby boomers doing these protesting. Yes, it was the boomers, but it seems like the Japanese boomers might have been better, although they also failed in their protesting, so maybe not. But the baby boomers were the first generation to continue to read manga after their late teens. Like, they continued to read it throughout adulthood. Now, some of this has to do with censorship and the fact that manga wasn't censored, as well as the topics that were being covered in manga. They discussed ideas of not being sure of one's identity, or upward mobility while also losing your roots and what that kind of meant. They also very specifically had child protagonists. Again, about Vietnam, I was talking about how this very moral idea behind everything. No matter whether they benefited from it financially or in any other way, they very much so held morals and keeping themselves to a high standard as something very important and fundamental to their movement. Part of this also had to do with their involvement in World War II. They were the generation that grew up a little bit during the war and very much so in the aftermath of the war. But they were children during this, so while they very much so felt the effects, they weren't really to blame for their involvement in the war or had anything to do or in control with it. They very much so saw their involvement in the war and themselves as aggressors in the war, and that as a bad thing that they needed to kind of have retribution for. And they put a lot of this onus on the adults, and they kind of saw the adults as the people who did that and wrongdoers, which was also kind of interesting because they very much wanted some of the aspects of what the adults had in their lives. They wanted those communities, they wanted those close-knit universities, and at the same time they very much so saw them as almost the enemy and the people who had done all these wrong things. But again, back to manga, they had child protagonists because children were innocent of these crimes. They hadn't done anything, so they were able to be protagonists and to move forward with this new, better life. Whereas adults as protagonists, well, they had this thing on them that couldn't allow them to do that. And also, in general, when you are a child, you want to see children as the protagonist. You want to see yourself in what you're reading. So I wonder if some of it wasn't even as deep as that, but just as, I want to see myself represented. Alright, I don't want to see my parents represented. I want to see me. With the death of the first student uprisings in the 1960s, we see the birth of the 1970s student uprisings. It was very clear that they needed something new to fight for. And so they found it in the environment, minority issues, and women's issues. Now, during the first student uprisings, women had been confined to very traditional roles. In those universities that they had to hold themselves in for their protests, women were forced to serve tea and mend things and do medical stuff, and that's it. They very much so were not seen as equal. When women were raped, that issue was not talked about or brought up, and it just... Then, in the aftermath of these protests, there was a free love movement. However, in a country with little sex education and where the pill was illegal, and so in the aftermath of this free love movement, women were forced to either have children or have abortions, and abortions were like crazy on the rise. Like, tons of women were being forced to have them, and so they were very rightfully upset, and they kept quiet throughout the entirety of the first uprisings because they didn't want to hurt the movement, so they just didn't say anything. However, in this clear kind of turn, they saw their opportunity to speak out about this as well as to start their own movements. Again, we really having a lot of tie-backs in this video. With Japan's involvement with World War II, another part of this was how minorities were affected by this. Because Japan and China were in a conflict, any Chinese or Chinese descendant people in Japan at the time were hugely discriminated against. And this had continued up until and even throughout 1970. And so as part of their introspection about their position in World War II and how they were the bad guys in this, there was also introspection about how this then affected the people in their own countries as well, being those minority groups. As for the environment, people were like straight up having mercury poisoning, and then also there was the whole, nuclear bombs thing, as well as just like nuclear reactor incidents and stuff. The environment, it wasn't climate change, it was like immediate dangers, so they started focusing on those again. Initially, they thought that when they dismantled capitalism that they would then be able to fix those issues. That's part of why it wasn't a focus before, but also just kind of like it wasn't their priority. Their priority was the academic system, and now they were like, oh hey, maybe we should focus on some of those other things. And, they were right. But they also failed in the 1970s. Student Uprisings also failed. But unlike the boomers here, I don't know if they started doing, like, tons of drugs and stuff. So, that's better. But now that you have all of the history, we can finally talk about how kawaii was born. So kawaii came from both the manga in that childish element that I was talking about before, as well as the increase in the women's movements and that focus on the issues that women were facing. Manga, even beyond the student uprisings, but even just for more casual people, very much so represented a more childish counterculture from traditionalism and was in its own way kind of like pushing against traditionalism. Much of Japan embraced these more childish countercultures as they were healing from the atrocities of World War II and also were finding their footing in this new urbanized world. Again, a part of these more casual ways of pushing against traditionalism was maruji, or round writing. It emerged in schools and was used by girls. Again, like I said in my kidcore video, it's hard to say if it's because it was just about women's issues or if it was because of some of the more harsh barriers put on boys and men about fitting into masculinity. From the research I read, it was girls who were doing this, but that's its own conversation for another day. Things like round writing were used to push against traditionalism and these expectations that were put in place for women and girls in a much less aggressive way. Again, they had all the same ideas and mentalities, even as some of the Western countercultures, but it was very specifically meant to be more soft. Much of the West had a much more adult way of approaching countercultures. A lot of them were very aggressive, in your face, and focused around drugs and sex, which are adult things. Part of the whole idea of the Japanese counterculture was to push away from adults and traditionalism. So protesting by then indulging in very adult things kind of went against that. I also know that discipline and self, like being the best self that you can be, was also very important to the Japanese in these countercultures. Giving into sex and drugs very much so goes against holding yourself to a moral superiority. All of that kind of culminated in stuff like kawaii being a much more preferred counterculture. Part of the childish nature of these things was also to kind of shrink away from these responsibilities that were trying to be pushed on them. They were too naive and innocent to then partake in these responsibilities was kind of the idea. So kawaii was kind of born from this. For the entirety of the 1970s, it went on without issue. It was just this cute aesthetic that people partook in. It was a way for women to push away from these ideas that were being pushed on them and from fitting into these barriers that they felt they had to. And everything was fine until the 80s. At the time, there were many, as they were called, parasite singles. People who were in their 20s to 30s who were single, employed, and still lived with their parents. So men also started wanting and looking for a way to kind of push away from these ideas and these constraints that were had on them. However, rather than partaking in kawaii and the clothes or the accessories or the stationery, instead they partook in kawaii by fetishizing it and by sexualizing the women in it. Fucking angry. And this would continue as kawaii spread across the world, which kawaii did very easily because it didn't scream that it was from any particular place. It didn't have any cultural ties to Japan. It had very neutral characters. The main kind of figure of kawaii was Sanrio, and very specifically Hello Kitty was the main character. And she's British. It's hard to say if this was a coincidence or if it was very specific on their part to kind of continue to push that Sanrio could be enjoyed by all and wasn't just a Japanese thing, which especially in the aftermath of World War II is very important to not be associated with being Japanese, as that would probably hurt sales. Not saying it's right, just saying it's the honesty of what happened post World War II. Initially, kawaii and Sanrio spread throughout Asia very quickly, as they had many of the similar issues, some of the counterculture and childishness was very much embraced by them, as they had the same issues with traditionalism, but it even started being picked up in the US. Although initially it was only really to teens, and then it started growing more so as, especially with millennials, honestly, a lot of millennials partake in a very childish thing, and I wonder if it has similar meanings and background to kawaii, and if that's something I should make a whole video about, because I'm y'all, when I started doing this research, I deadass went out to my parents because they were eating dinner, and I started exclaiming about all these similarities and stuff, and they were like, that's cool, darling. Alright. You're done? Alright, have fun. And yeah, I'm definitely gonna make that video. I'm saying I might. I'm definitely gonna make it. As we see kawaii spread throughout the world, we also see the spread of the sexualization of kawaii. Now, it's painted as if that's how men participated in it, but I feel like wording it like that makes it sound like they held the same ideals as kawaii, which they fundamentally cannot, because kawaii is supposed to be non-sexual and very pointedly not adult, and so by sexualizing it, they're very much so not participating in kawaii, bastardizing kawaii. And it feels less so like they're participating, and more so like they're just kind of being weird. It's even more weird when you think about the fact that this is supposed to be centered around childish things, children under 18, not allowed, illegal, and naivety and innocence, things that should be very separate from sex. So instead, I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say that maybe because I don't know how to. So instead, I'm just gonna say that they weren't participating, and that they probably just were kind of weird, or that they just, I don't know. I don't know. I can't, I'm not going to explain and say that there's an explanation for what they did, because it's just weird and disgusting, and I hate it. And I don't know how my one little video would change anything about that, but I want people to know that it's weird and messed up, alright? So now you know, and you also know about the Japanese Student Uprisings, which I think is a very interesting topic. So now you know more about those things, and you know why I'm angry, and maybe you're angry too. I hope, despite this, that you still have a wonderful day, week, an entire month. Boom. You can't have a bad time anymore, because Leah said so. And I hope to see y'all later. Bye.